This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to Speaking of Asia, and I'm Ravi. In this episode, I focus on Indian foreign policy in the wake of the recent election in which the Narendra Modi government was returned for a third term, although with a reduced majority. Mr. Modi has now equaled founding Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's record. That said, his survival is dependent on coalition allies since his party no longer has a standalone majority. While there's been much discussion on India's likely economic reset going forward, much less has been said and heard about foreign policy. To discuss this with me today is the distinguished foreign policy scholar and commentator, Professor C Raja Mohan. Welcome to Speaking of Asia, Dr. Raj Mohan.
Thank you for inviting me.
Raja, the new government has just taken office and your friend, Dr. Jaishankar, retains his post as External Affairs Minister. What should we expect from the Modi government in its third iteration as far as foreign policy is concerned?
No, my sense is the appointment of Mr. Jaishankar, it signals a continuity in a way that Mr. Jaishankar distinguished himself as an efficient diplomat at a time when India had to go through some complex moments during the pandemic and the Galwan crisis. So I think he provided a steady hand and the capacity to navigate between complex dynamics that were at play. So I believe he enjoys full confidence with Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. So therefore, Mr. Jaishankar's being there sends a signal of reassurance to a lot of India's interlocutors around the world. Broadly speaking, the challenge for Mr. Jaishankar would be this. Now, the navigation between major powers as a beginning to draw against each other has been very skillful so far. It's almost like a high-wire act that Mr. Jaishankar was embarked in. What is often said, engaging America, managing China, reassuring Russia, and cultivating Europe. This fine balancing act, of course, will come under stress now, given the intensification of the confrontation between the US and Russia, that is, US, Europe, and Russia, and between US and China. So I think as we enter a more stormy moments, the pressure on India to make more decisive moves, for example, on Ukraine, is largely ducked the question of Russian invasion, justified it in different ways. But the fact is, if the conflict intensifies, then I think, how does India deal with it? That's one question. Second, I think in Asia, if it boils over on Taiwan, if the conflict between China and the Philippines and others intensifies, then again, India can't approach this as a distant problem, but it has to engage with it. And as you mentioned in your column recently, the dynamic interaction between different theaters around China's periphery, that is East China Sea, South China Sea, the Taiwan question, and then the Himalayan frontier. I think these are integrated, that if one theater falls, the pressure on the others will mount. So in some ways, I think India, there is a recognition now, if something happens in Taiwan, the pressure on India will actually increase. So I think we are in a new situation. So addressing this requires a lot more skill, and I think some choices will have to be eventually made. I would just conclude this part with saying that Mr. Jaishankar is traveling with the Prime Minister to G7. Then he'll also travel with him to Kazakhstan to meet the Chinese and the Russian leaders at the SCO summit. So I think they'll have a chance firsthand to assess where the global dynamic is going, and then find ways to navigate this and manage this in the coming months and weeks.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that you spoke about the need possibly to make some choices. Could you tell us a bit more about what you were thinking of when you used those words?
No, for example, India would want to tone down the confrontation with China. That would give it a lot more relief that it is not fighting on so many fronts. But if it doesn't if it doesn't see flexibility on the part of Xi Jinping to temper down the conflict in the Himalayas, again, as you mentioned in your column, it's actually the entire border, which is almost counting that of Nepal and Bhutan. It's more than 4,000 kilometers. And this entire stretch today is locked in a semi-permanent military confrontation between India and China. So I think if there's no breakthrough in fixing the current problem in Eastern Ladakh and taking a fresh look to the management of the boundary, then I think the danger of at some point things going out of hand at any one of this 4,000 kilometers is a real possibility. And if there is no breakthrough with China, which means actually India will have to get closer to the United States and build stronger ties with the US and its allies in Asia. That in turn will complicate the relationship with Russia. So therefore, I think time has come for India going beyond saying we don't want to confront anyone, we are the friends of all. And in fact, the new phrase Mr. Jaishankar now and Mr. Modi both use, Vishwa Bandhu Bharat, which means India that is friendly to everyone. But then, as we know, there are problems with China. And therefore, that is a principal question. How that plays out will have effects on the rest of the relationships.
Prime Minister Modi does not have an absolute majority in parliament. Do you think that could affect foreign policy?
Not at all. I mean, I don't see the coalition having such a big effect. After all, you covered Indian government before. I mean, we've had minority governments running foreign policy. But if you go back to in the old days to Indira Gandhi from 69 to 71, she was a minority government. Then all the governments that we've had, the VP Singh government, the Narasimha Rao government, the Vajpayee government, the Manmohan Singh government, I mean, all of them were running either large coalitions or minority governments. So my sense is there is a broad consensus on foreign policy. I had a chance to analyze the manifestos on the foreign policy sections of the manifestos of the Congress and the BJP, which were largely similar. I mean, in a way, that there is, there can always be, confrontation irrespective of the merits of the issue. But largely on the great powers question, on the China question, on the Pakistan question, on the idea of regional integration, there is broad agreement. So if the government, I think this is the key, if Mr. Modi adopts a more consensual approach, that is last 10 years, he didn't have to consult them. But if you recall how Narasimha Rao and Mr. Vajpayee used to constantly consult the opposition before they took any major step. So I think he'll have to institute a consultative approach, which he himself said at the acceptance speech when the coalition elected him as the leader. And I think that must extend to foreign policy. So regular informing each other, telling the leaders, opposition leaders, look, this is what's happening. That'll do a lot of good. Equally important, one will presume Rahul Gandhi will be nominated as the leader of the opposition, which we've had the tradition of leader of the opposition being engaged with all the visiting dignitaries. So that could resume. That again would create another layer of consultation. And as far as the coalition partners are concerned, I mean, Mr. Naidu of the Telugu Desam Party, he's a pro-reformist. He's also, that Andhra people from Andhra, or the biggest community in the US today, they're all entrepreneurs, techies. So I think there is actually, in some senses, there is a new bridge to the United States. The Naidu government, unlike the Jagan government, is more entrepreneurial, and the Andhra connection with Silicon Valley, with the US, I think would also be a positive factor.
It's interesting that you mentioned Andhra Pradesh in the United States, because you sit in a bus in Seattle, which is the headquarters of Microsoft, and very often you can hear Telugu being spoken in some part of the bus. So it's quite interesting, the sheer presence of people from Andhra in the US today. Staying on the subject of Andhra and Mr. Naidu, and it also happens to be your home state, Raja, Andhra Pradesh access to the world, if you discount the cyber part of it, physically is through the sea, and it faces the eastern seaboard. Could this affect the way Mr. Naidu looks or has some input on foreign policy?
Because I think one of the ideas that is floating around, because I think under the previous Chief Minister, Jagan Mohan Reddy, there was very little development, very little infrastructure. See, Andhra Pradesh enjoys a very long coastline. And we have the Visakhapatnam port at the top, but there's no other ports have been developed over the last 75 years. And here, I think there's a huge chance. And this region, as you know, is also the most developed part of Andhra Pradesh, mostly entrepreneurs. So you have, I think, a huge chance to turn the coastline of Andhra into a dynamic zone, much like what Deng Xiaoping did with China's East Coast. Here, I think there is a chance for the first time Mr. Naidu and Mr. Modi work together to really think more boldly about the role that Andhra could play in India's economic development, and then as a destination for connecting with East Asia. There's a lot of talk about land-based connectivity, Northeast and Southeast Asia. But I would say the maritime routes are far more easier to build across the Bay of Bengal, across the Andaman Sea. So I think there'll be a lot of possibilities for leveraging Andhra's positive and forward-looking approach and being a coalition partner where he has the say in these kind of things. I think we could turn this into a great advantage. And Mr. Naidu, as we know, was a great admirer of Lee Kuan Yew, and he tried to build this relationship and tried to get the Singaporeans to build the capital. Unfortunately, it fell apart under his successor. But now I think he certainly has a chance of looking back at Singapore, taking a fresh look, both sides, and seeing how they can revive a new relationship between India, Singapore, India, Southeast Asia, and India and East Asia.
Mm-hmm. Staying on the subject of the Eastern Seaboard, which obviously it looks out towards China in some ways. How bad is the situation on the border really? And Dr. Jaishankar seemed to prioritize China in his remarks to the media as he took office for a second consecutive term as foreign minister.
Look, I think the situation has really been a deadlock. Since April 2020, when China moved a large number of troops into Ladakh, and then India responded with its own deployment. So we have actually 50,000 troops deployed at 17,000 feet. At one point, guns from the tanks were staring at each other. So we averted probably the danger of a direct, immediate conflict. But the large-scale deployment in eastern Ladakh and the confrontation all across the long line of actual control, I think it's never been as bad as it is today. Many of the CBMs, or the so-called confidence-building measures that we had built from early 90s till 2014, many of them have now really are in a limbo. Given the change in the dynamic on the ground, China has built more infrastructure in Tibet, India is building infrastructure. So one is to de-escalate the current confrontation. And then I think the two sides will have to negotiate new protocols, new principles for keeping the border peaceful. And it was peaceful almost 50 years until 2020. But now I think we need to find a way to go there. I think there are military solutions. The key is, will the political leaders, certainly Mr. Xi, will he see the unfortunate action, which has not really benefited China? I think he might have got control of a small piece of territory, but he's lost India in that sense. So I think if China takes a fresh look and if India is willing to respond, there are ways in which the boundary issue can be diffused, and then take a fresh look at the larger relationship, political and economic relationship, which has all been frozen because of the military situation.
Right. I'm reminded that in 1962, shortly after Pandit Nehru won through for a third time, there was war on the border. Are you scared? Are you apprehensive that history could repeat itself?
I think it's entirely possible. As I said, look, we are in a semi-permanent military confrontation. But I think India will stand up. It has no choice. It is not a question of if it happens, as we saw happen in 2020, just when the pandemic was beginning to happen, India deployed a large number of troops. Since then, Mr. Modi has devoted a lot of energy to building infrastructure on the border. So I think India will have no choice but to stand up to protect its territorial integrity. Here, I think we should be clear. India is not the one which has taken the offensive, but it is not going to back off for the sake of good relations, that it needs some honorable settlement. Otherwise, India has the capability and the capacity to absorb significant costs to take a strong defensive position all along the frontier.
To change the subject a little bit, India had been rapidly building ties with the United States and some other Western countries such as Canada and even Australia, which is so much in the Western camp. But things seem to have gone a bit sour lately with all these countries. What happened and what can be done to remedy this situation?
No, I beg to differ with you on the characterization that it has gone sour with all of them. No. In fact, I would say Canada is an exception, but I would say India's relationship with the US has never been as good as it is today. The scale, the intensity, and the depth of engagement. I don't think the Panun episode, unfortunate and ill-advised.
You're talking about the Sikh lawyer against whom there was an assassination threat in the US. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't think that has fundamentally affected the nature of the relationship. I would say it was a timely warning for India in a sense. not to embark on these kind of adventures, especially in friendly countries. So my sense is the two systems are determined to manage this crisis because the stakes in the relationship have gone up so much. So neither Washington nor Delhi is going to allow a screw up like this to undermine the huge amount of political investments both of them have made in expanding this relationship. So I think I don't see a threat to the relationship. India-UK relationship has also been very good under the Tories. India is also engaged with Starmer, the incoming Labour leader who's going to likely to become the Prime Minister. With Australia, relationship has been excellent. So with New Zealand, New Zealand not as great, but nevertheless, it's reasonably good. It's really with Canada, especially under Mr. Trudeau's Canada, that we're having problems, where Mr. Trudeau's domestic politics, his dependence on a Sikh party, has created a dynamic for him, which kind of is a problem for India. So therefore, barring Canada, I would say India's relationship with the rest of the Western countries has never been as good. Economic, trade, and other relationships are growing. But I think what the Canada thing reminds us is that the Indian diaspora can be a two-edged sword. That the growth of Indian diaspora across English-speaking world, largely, unlike in the Gulf, there are labor that will come back in these 5 English-speaking countries, that is US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. The size of the Indian diaspora is growing. They're mostly professionals. They're beginning to have an impact on the domestic politics. So I think we have here a danger that India's domestic politics will intersect with the domestic political mobilization in the Anglo-Saxon world. So therefore, I think what we need is really both India and the Anglosphere, the 5 eyes, if you will. They need their law enforcement agencies sitting together and saying, look, what are the red lines we need to do? How do we tip off each other? What potential dangers that are coming up? So I would be calling for a greater, deeper engagement between the deep states, if you will, the security establishments of India and the Anglosphere, because that's where most of the diaspora is concentrated.
What about Russia, the traditional security partner? In the new geopolitical reality, Russia's position is altered and it's now seen as a junior partner to China. How is this affecting Indian thinking?
Look, I think, I don't know if you saw other day our former Army Chief General Narendra talked about this, that look, a lot of people don't agree that Russia has become a junior partner. A lot of people hope in India that Russia will remain an independent actor. So if Russia remains an independent actor, I mean, that will be of great value for not only for India, but whole of Asia. But there's a large number of people who are skeptical whether India has the capacity to keep Russia as an independent power, because Russia has problems with the West. It has very good logic to align closely with China. Russia and China have very common shared interests against the West. And the trade relationship between Russia and China are growing volumes by volumes, leaps and bounds, if you will. So I think the Russia-China relationship today overshadows India-Russia relationship. So therefore, I think Russia can't be the factor like it was in the past, where it helped India to balance the region. That will be less difficult. So my sense is, as India outgrows the Russian relationship, India's economy today, GDP is almost twice that of Russia. India has a much more diverse set of relationships. So I would think India would like to keep Russia on its side, but the weight of the relationship is, I think, structurally bound to decline.
Right. Does this give New Delhi the opening to pursue an even closer relationship with the United States?
Yeah, both US and Europe as well. I mean, I would say what the Ukraine crisis has done is it's compelled India to take a fresh look at Europe, because historically we tended to look at Europe either through the British eyes or through the Russian eyes. Both of them were very distorting prisms in understanding Europe. But today, I think we've seen under Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaishankar, last 10 years, there's been a sincere effort to reach out to the Europeans. The relationship with France has expanded, trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union. And the engagement with European countries as a whole has significantly increased. So my sense is that Europe is going to become an important part of India's multipolar calculus. And I think that's a good thing.
I see. If you look at the way India approaches the United States, it does look from here, seeing it the way it's operated in the Red Sea and provided security cover there for shipping and so forth, that somehow it seems to be more comfortable handling the US with an Atlantic lens than a Pacific lens, because issues like the Quad, it seems to be, if not backtracking, at least soft-pedaling the whole thing. Is that the correct way to look at this?
No, I'm afraid not. In fact, if you saw just 4 years ago, people are saying India joining the Quad, India can work with the US in the Pacific. But there's no chance in hell that India would sit with the Americans in the Middle East. Because historically, as you know, India had very little in common with the US in the Middle East. We were anti-Israel, we were anti-US, we were anti-imperialist. India was like the countries like the Baathists, like Saddam Hussein and this ilk. But today, India is working with the US and the Middle East, with Israel, with the Gulf countries. So there is a transformation in the Gulf and the Middle East relationship. So both I2U2, which brings India, US together with Israel and the United Arab Emirates, the IMEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor that connects us to Europe. These are very interesting initiatives. And if once peace is regained in the Middle East, these initiatives will take off. But in East, I think we've come a long way over the last 30 years from opposing American presence in the region to actually working with. And I would say the Quad, that India says Quad is not a military alliance. I don't think that's fudging the issue. And I think that's a decision taken consciously with ASEAN in mind to recognize the sensitivities of India's neighbors in the East, that India does not want to make this a military alliance because it already inflames the situation. And I think most of our friends in ASEAN don't like to see Quad as a military alliance. So I think it's worked well for India to do all its military engagement with the US bilaterally. The US does its stuff with the treaty allies. That includes Japan and Korea and the Australians. And the Quad becomes a more positive public goods producing agency, which I think makes ASEAN comfortable. And we've already seen that happen over the last few years. There's less opposition to Quad in the ASEAN. So I would say that was a good move by India to avoid turning Quad into a military alliance.
Final question. What should East Asia expect from Modi version 3.0? One hears formulations such as look East turning into act East and so forth, but so little translates. India was not even present at the recent Shangri-La dialogue in any meaningful way.
No, my sense is I think we should go beyond the slogans. I think we need to look at actually see formally where can we move faster. For example, India is close to $4 trillion Indian economy. ASEAN is already just above $4 trillion. So irrespective of whether we have a free trade agreement, whether India is part of RCEP or not, the two economies are growing. They will be, whether you want it or not, there's room for much greater economic and commercial interaction. And then you put in the technology pile on top of it. There is a huge amount of things. So I think it's focus on getting practical things done rather than merely mouthing slogans that we tended to do quite a bit. Second, I think on security cooperation, at least some of the ASEAN countries see India's presence as a balancing factor. We've seen India finally delivering things to Philippines. It's willing to deploy its navy a little more. So my sense is that as India builds up its own capabilities, it expands its own defense production, it should be able to contribute to defense capability building in Southeast Asia and East Asia. So I would say focus on the practical rather than merely talking about big goals. Look East or act East. What matters is more physical connectivity. We've already seen more flights going on, more tourists coming from India, more digital connectivity in terms of technology, more, I would say, security and defense cooperation. All these are possible, and there's a lot of room here. I would finally say here, no, we should not compare India to China on this score. A lot of hope in the 90s was, look, India will be the second engine to ASEAN along with China. But the fact is, China today's economy is 5 times bigger than India's. So I think to see from China lens often distorts, one underestimates what has been achieved, and it kind of ignores what can be done. So I think take India, core India, and then look at it. Look, we've come to $100 billion trade. We can do things today. So focus on what can be done rather than saying, look, whether put excess goals and then feel disappointed with it.
Very interesting insights. And thank you so much for coming and Speaking of Asia, Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi.
And that's a wrap for Speaking of Asia, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm Ravi Veloor. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. If you'd like to read my articles, we have links in our podcast show notes below.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.